Coming up, as the NBA playoffs roll on, we take a look at the Minnesota Timberwolves and the Oklahoma City Thunder. Young superstars at their core, making the NBA landscape at a minimum a very congested and difficult path for the Brooklyn Nets to jump in on. We dive in coming up next.
You are Locked On Nets, your daily Brooklyn Nets podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Yes, my friends, it is the Locked On Nets podcast right here on the Locked On Podcast Network. It's your team, the Brooklyn Nets, every single day. Over there is Doug Norrie. I'm Adam Armbrecht. We thank you, as always, for making us your first listen of the day. We're free on all those great platforms. But game off, we got to talk more about Monopoly Go. This fast-paced game lets you team up with friends for tournaments to unlock awesome prizes like unique stickers for trading, cool playing pieces, and hilarious emojis for taunting your friends. So download Monopoly Go now and play for free on Google Play or the Apple Store. Game on. And Doug, games that have been going on all across the NBA playoffs might be a foreign subject for Brooklyn Nets fans because we're not in them. Nevertheless, we keep seeing all these themes and threads to pull on, specifically about young superstars. We're going to get into not only Anthony Edwards with the Timberwolves, we're going to get with SGA and the Thunder, and just a little tip of the cap as we dive in, Doug, to the other New York-based team that's going ahead and taking care of business as the Knicks had the Pacers well under control in a nice little comeback last night.
Yeah, I think what these playoffs are really showing us is that we're at a really, we can be kind of threading on this for a little bit, but it's really getting hammered home over the last few days, is that we're just at a complete inflection point for the NBA where there is a definitive changing of the guard. It's obvious. There's like really no ifs, ands, or buts about it. Most of the aging superstars are not even in the playoffs anymore. LeBron, right. Steph, KD, like even like Giannis, is out of this now. And we're looking at a landscape within the league that has shifted young very fast. And it might be a blip because of just injuries and just how some of these other teams are constructed, and as usually happens with history, it could just be the new normal because the things that seem new all of a sudden become the thing that sticks. We could be looking at the complete youth movement in the NBA. And if that's the case, the Nets are at a precarious point here with their rebuilding because it's going to be very difficult to contend with teams that are built on youthful superstars under contract, built through the draft, adding the pieces as they go. And that's just might be an uphill climb for a lot of these other teams if you're on the wrong side of the age curve.
It's so funny, and I want to start with the Timberwolves just because they're taking on the defending champs in the Nuggets, and we're going to get to the Thunder game, which is going to be going on later tonight on Thursday night. But quickly on that second team, just because I always find it funny, you mentioned about takes time, sometimes it's a slow burn to realize. Well, they did go in as the number one seed in the Western Conference, the Thunder. Like sometimes I think there's a breadcrumb trail that we all see and we're kind of following throughout an NBA season, but it takes until you get to the playoffs because that is when it matters most. And veteran teams care more about the ultimate prize than they do about the journey getting there. So I think it's fascinating that we are seemingly at this point, and you said it a couple episodes ago about it probably happened or started happening a year ago, but we're now seeing the full fruition of it. So it's funny to not quite get there. Like we all maybe, it's not not lament it, but we all kind of don't fully buy in because you haven't seen these young players do it yet. You haven't seen these young teams fully do it yet. So you're always willing to, err on the side of veteran and experience and the track record. And then, like you say, click. Oh, son of a gun. LeBron James, Kevin Durant, all these guys are no longer in the scene. And now we're talking about the Timberwolves and Anthony Edwards and what it could look like if they take down the defending champs, the Denver Nuggets.
Yeah, you always want to see it in the playoffs, and I think that's been the hammer home point because you can get by in the regular season. So you can get by in the regular season on just sort of being young and not being injured, right? Like OKC had no injuries this year. Minnesota dealt with, was mostly healthy this year, right? Like, and sometimes your record can be built on the idea that you just had all your guys the whole year.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
And sometimes that is just easier when you're young. And so that's why the playoff becomes the real crucible. The playoffs become the real crucible because at that point, it's like, well, assuming everyone's putting now their best foot forward, willing to play all their guys all the minutes, right? Like being able to play their 6-7 guys in a tight rotation, whatever it is. Now we're going to get a real look at, sort of like how well you're built for this thing. Turns out these teams are built incredibly well, right? Like Minnesota might be. I mean, Minnesota's scary. Like they haven't lost a game, right? And they've taken care of Denver, the champion, with relative ease. And so these situations, and OKC kind of handled Dallas pretty easily. Now you want to say, well, Jamal Murray's hurt. You want to say Luka's hurt. Okay, I can hear all that. It doesn't take away from the fact that they're still are clearly already kind of playoff tested.
Yeah.
And that's the part where I agree with you. You look at the record, you're like, oh, could we have seen it coming? We can. You just got you have to take that one extra step into this. We're all playing our best guys now. What's it going to look like? But I think like that, to me, sort of even no matter what happens from here on out, it's already been answered, right? Like we already know the answer.
And it's funny, too, and I agree with you. It's funny, too, in the Western Conference specifically, because we're talking about these two teams. When you go and look at it, all throughout the year and then entering the playoffs, man, the Western Conference is a gauntlet. You see how stacked those teams are. It's going to be very difficult for any of these teams to make it out. And I still agree with that premise. But once we get to like the Western Conference Finals, once we get to the NBA Finals, and on both sides of the bracket, you're going to look back and say, oh, how difficult was it really? Now, the Eastern Conference was already weaker, and then you add in the injuries, and it feels like it's become this very weird journey to who wants to lose to Boston in the Eastern Conference Finals. But in the West, like I will say, to your point, well, Timberwolves made incredibly easy work out of the Phoenix Suns, a team that we kind of thought was set up to maybe have some issues, never looked like they fully clicked. Dallas took care of the Clippers, an aging team that getting down the stretch, right? Like, it does feel like even just in the second round now, we can already start to crystallize where some of these teams were and where some of them are going to be heading when it comes to the offseason. And the fact that it looks like it's Timberwolves and the Thunder headed towards a collision with one another, that to me can dismiss some of the injuries that have happened over the course of these playoffs, can dismiss some of the sub-narratives and just go youth, young superstars. And now we're talking about the next wave of what we're going to be seeing specifically in the West. And we'll talk a little bit about the East as we move through the playoffs as well.
Yeah. And this is where, this is all, I mean, look, this is a Brooklyn Nets podcast. This is where we have to like sort of wrap this back into the Nets too, because it's like they're at their own inflection point where they're kind of having to decide which direction to go. Now, I think they've already decided which direction, but let's leave it open for interpretation for a moment.
I feel like they should be more open to the possibility.
I mean, maybe they are. Maybe they are. And it's like hard. And we'll talk about this in a second, but like they might be open to it, but you're never going to be like, we'll see, right? To the fan base.
Yeah.
Like, maybe.
Conference.
Or or you got your players out there buying houses in Brooklyn, right? Like,
yep.
And you got these guys who are making their lives. You're never going to go out there and be like, you might want to rent. Might want to stay renting instead of going for the full buy. Just saying.
Does that have a sublet option? No, I don't know.
I know you're looking at that place, but like, have you thought about renting? Like maybe month to month. Like that feels kind of good too. Also, so even if you were thinking about taking a different direction, I don't think you would ever, up until the minute you made the moves, ever actually say it out loud, just because of who you already have coming into the building every day.
100%. Let's tap in here in a second to the Minnesota Timberwolves. Anthony Edwards. Oh my goodness. What the heck just happened? He all of a sudden ascended to one of the greatest players in NBA history, potentially. We'll get into that model. How did the Minnesota get there, and what does their path forward look like, and how should that potentially influence the Brooklyn Nets this offseason? We'll get into that in just one moment.
All right, before we get to that, I'll tell you about our friends over at Yahoo Finance. Look, we live in precarious financial times here, folks. You've got a lot of stuff out there. We got all different kinds of accounts. You want to be able to see it all in one place. Maybe you're like me, you got the Charles Schwab account, you have the IRA accounts with Vanguard. You want to be able to, log into just one site and see it all rather than have to fiddle around all through the internet to see where your holdings are. This is where Yahoo Finance just gets you straight to the point, allows you to see that portfolio and how it's rising, hopefully, every single day. You got inflation in there too, or falling on a day-to-day basis. But the key is you're able to see it all. You're able to have all of your financial view in one place. You're able to just consolidate it with a really, really easy kind of click of the mouse. This is what Yahoo Finance brings. I've been using Yahoo Finance for over a decade now. even just to make some of the biggest decisions I'm making on an investment level for more than 25 years. Yahoo Finance has been the brand behind every great investor, whether you're a seasoned investor or just looking to get that extra guidance out there. Yahoo Finance gives you all the tools and data and all in one place, the number one finance destination. Got a holistic view of all the financial news cycles, breaking news, editorial perspective, analyst ratings. It's all there for comprehensive financial news and analysis. Visit the brand behind every great investor, yahoofinance.com, the number one financial destination, yahoofinance.com. That's yahoofinance.com.
All right, so as we continue today's Locked On Nets episode, we remind you, you can get us over on YouTube. You can get us on the podcast feeds. You can hear all of the whimsical musings of Doug Norrie at Doug Norrie over on X, at Adam Arbrecht, and at Locked On Nets as well. Just a little reminder, in case you're wondering where you can find us. It's everywhere, and it's all the time. Now, when we talk about the Minnesota Timberwolves, their model is so interesting. We had friend of the show, Billy Reinhart. People have been talking about the success and how these models have been built. It's funny that Karl Anthony Towns, the guy who was talked about being like, boy, they're going to have to find a way to unload this massive contract. Maybe the Brooklyn Nets want to bring him home to the East Coast at some point. Boy, was that Rudy Gobert an absolute insane overpay? What is this team thinking? Well, now you're heading towards the Western Conference Finals, and it looks like you have a chance to win a championship. And Anthony Edwards, this young superstar, emerges. And all of a sudden, every move and all of the pieces just fall into place. And you go, wow, what a stroke of genius. All it took was having that high draft pick to get that absolute stud player to let all these veteran talents who are very good, and just won Defensive Player of the Year for Rudy Gobert. But you need that piece to be in place to have it all click and be successful.
Yeah, I made a misstep the other day because I was saying that I was like, oh, the Timberwolves are ahead of schedule, and that has to worry the Nets. And they're like, ahead of schedule? This team sucked for 20 years, which was the right response to that. But the caveat I will say is, which leads into this, is they were ahead of schedule on Ant's timeline. Like, yes, it was,
because I that's the way I read it when you said it. Another friend of the show, I'll get their name in here when I remember it. They were saying, yeah, but Karl Anthony Towns. I was like, oh no, I'm talking about the Anthony Edwards timeline.
Yeah. The idea so it's like, the Timberwolves stunk for decades. I get that. It was more about the Anthony Edwards piece. It was about SG, because it was like the Thunder, and it was basically the idea that the Thunder and Timberwolves are way better earlier than we thought, based on their best guys. That was really it. And I didn't caveat it by saying they're by their best guys. When you look at it through that view and you're like, oh, Anthony Edwards is 22, right? Like, and now he's, on the verge of becoming the face of the league, which is just totally crazy. Like, these are situations you kind of have to monitor in your ability to be able to beat the best teams later on, right? So yeah, Karl Anthony Towns, they've been through multiple iterations of the Towns era, but basically what they had to find out was Towns is great when he's the second best player. If Towns is your second best player, your team's awesome, right? And and then you have an absolute, defensive player of the year in Rudy Gobert to kind of like bring on this somewhat newer version of basketball, which is to go twin tower spacing and never be able to do anything. Plus they got McDaniel. It's like they built like sort of like this almost kind of perfect team. It was that line was about Edwards. It's like, 22 years old and being the best guy on a championship, possibly caliber team.
Yeah.
That happened earlier than I think most people thought. And so that is where, again, you have to go back and recalibrate. I don't think you should be in the mode of giving up because other teams are good. And I'm actually really not contending that. I'm just saying, like, you just shouldn't go in the tank because you're like, well, those guys are going to be good forever. I don't think that would be the right thing to do, but it does have to have you at least a little concerned when you're building a new team, which is to say there's this new group of guys. They are really good. They all probably could be the best guy on a championship team. Edwards, SGA, I still put Jokic in there. Like, this group is already out there. Plus you got Tatum, plus you got like the Boston guys. And now you're like, well, I don't have one of those guys. I might be able to get the older versions of some of these guys.
Yeah.
Is that going to be enough for a whole regular season and a playoff run? This year would contend that it's not, because no one can stay healthy. But it's just a weird spot to be in. I don't think a lot of teams probably looked at this and thought it's going to happen this quickly, but it sure seems like it is. And Edwards is like easily the tent pole for this, for what's happening here, because he just looks so amazing.
I mean, by the way, like, first of all, the injury piece of it, because you thought about that before. It's like everybody getting injured this year. Like, it seems like it. Everybody getting injured this year has opened up this door for like the turnover to happen, and it happens every year. But it just seems like it's it's hit at all the right levels to go look at how much this landscape has opened up and all the right ages for all these players for Anthony
Well,
Edwards kind of kicking the door. Go ahead.
sorry to interrupt you, but like one more thing to think about too is like as we get into this other new version of the NBA, two other new versions of the NBA, which are, hey, you kind of have to play all the games, which has been
Yes.
which was the marching orders for this year, which was don't give me a 50 game effort if you're not really hurt. Like we're gonna want to see 60 plus.
Yep.
And everyone kind of got on board with that, by the way. Now, I'm not saying that contributed to the injuries because there's been the data on that is really weird about like, whether or not playing more gets you more injured. I mean, clearly you would say the more you play, the better chance you have to get injured,
Right.
right? That's just always going to be the case. But like, so there's that piece. And if there's also this new thing, which is like, hey, you got to play all the games and it's going to be way more physical because that refs
Yeah.
have just kind of swallowed the whistle on like the physicality in the playoffs and really at the end of the year. I don't know, man. That doesn't breed well for a guy who's getting up there in years.
Oh no,
Right? Like that's not a landscape you want to enter with guys who are a little long in the NBA tooth already.
100%. And it's one of those things like this is a bit of just a side note too, because you mentioned about like the physicality, and the Timberwolves are a prime example of that
Oh
with
yeah.
the Nuggets. Like there's like, hey, we're gonna brutalize you, and the refs are like, hey, this is the brand of this playoff series. But what I find fascinating about that, especially for like Anthony Edwards, he is a young, very physical player. This is how like the NBA shifts a little bit too. How are the best players in our game playing the game? That dictates how we call games. That dictates how physical games become, right? So, and when you think about LeBron James is like a bull in a china shop for the bulk of his career, but a guy like Kevin Durant, guys that are more finesse based, like okay, that's going to be kind of the style of the league, and that's great, and it's beautiful basketball, and you get to see these amazing shots and these amazing playmakers. But if you start to turn into over the next 5 years or so, as Anthony Edwards just starts to enter into his prime, where it's like, you want to play against us, it's going to be a more physical brand of basketball. You can look in the Eastern Conference and see some teams doing that as well. Boston does a good job defensively being a physical type of team. I have another conversation for another episode about Jaylen Brown being far more important to that team's success in the playoffs than Jason Tatum potentially. But hey, that's a call to tease. But it is that interesting thing, including this shift getting younger. It's also, what's the style going to be? And you mentioned before, one last note before we get into OKC, the idea of Minnesota being on the come up here and how it influences the Brooklyn Nets. I think back to the Golden State Warriors run when it was, well, okay, it's big three time, right? You have to build your team to be able to run with and beat the Warriors. And in the end, for the most part, that was a failing endeavor because you couldn't beat that team because you didn't have Steph Curry and Klay Thompson and Draymond Green and Kevin Durant at a certain point too. So I think one of the influences for Brooklyn should be, my goodness, look at the landscape. But do not start holding up different teams and saying, how do we build ourselves to beat Team X? It should always come back to, how do we build a successful team? How do we build a strong team? How do we keep taking shots at getting young players in here? Because in the end, the Minnesota model that seems to be working right now was one that we all criticized from afar for the last couple of years, saying, I don't know if this is ever going to work out for them. And then all of a sudden, Anthony Edwards emerges and all the pieces around him are perfect. And now you see this team maybe having a really interesting window here to be pretty dominant across the Western Conference.
Yeah, actually, well, I'm going to say speak for when I made I was reminded of this the other day, and I wasn't going to take this lap, but I remember when they made the Rudy Gobert trade, I got a text the other day from a buddy of mine on like a basketball thread that we have, and he was like, I take it back. You were right about the Minnesota thing. Because at the time I was like, oh, I like this trade. It's trying to zag a little bit and going like super ultra big. Now
we make our own version of our team. Yeah.
I was like, I like it. I like the idea. Like, I like this idea. It's very different. I can understand why you want to do it. Now, where I would not take the lap is like, I was kind of saying I thought the Towns Gobert thing would work. I didn't see Edwards being this good this quickly. So it was like sort of like right idea, wrong basis point. But I did like the idea in general, but I would say that it was like not exactly for the reason it's working now.
Let's talk about here in a second, Oklahoma City Thunder, SGA. There is a very specific thing that they did for their team when they had another star no longer in the playoffs and Paul George briefly, that the Brooklyn Nets could look at as being a very tangible model over the next couple of seasons. We'll get into that coming up here next.
All right, before we get to that, tell you about our friends over at Monopoly Go. Got to get into it once again. Just so much great stuff in this game. In Monopoly Go, you team up with friends for time tournaments. You work together to build up each other's boards. And the more you win together, the more awesome prizes you unlock. That's the power of friendship, baby. There's so much to get. You can grab unique stickers. You trade with your friends. You complete those big albums for those ultra big prizes. Cool new playing pieces to travel the classic Monopoly board with. You can grab the emojis too. You can taunt your friends too. Sometimes it's about the power of friendship. Sometimes it's about taunting your friends when you smash their buildings or heist their vaults. Plus, Monopoly Go feels new and exciting every single day, constantly changing tournaments and challenges. A ton include their own unique mini games. You can dig for treasure. You can grab some of that robot machine stuff as well. There's always new timed events help you win big, massive multipliers for everything you win or rent frenzies. Always something fun to discover on Monopoly Go. Get off the bench. Go download it for free on Google Play or the App Store. Monopoly Go, game on.
All right, so as we conclude the Locked On Nets episode, NBA playoffs in full throttle here, focusing in on the Western Conference and teams that could or should influence the way the Brooklyn Nets go about constructing their next version of their team. Doug did briefly mention there, you got I like that it was Cam Thomas bought a spot right up from the training facility. He's like, dude, like I could hop out of bed and roll into training. Fantastic. The other one though was Mikal Bridges also bought one, but for some reason I love the idea. Two parts of it. One, he's like bought his place at auction, which for some reason I'm like, oh, okay, guys trying to save a buck. You know what I mean? You wait, you try to strike the market when it's right. Now it was like north of $6 million. So I don't know. It's just you're operating on different financial levels than me. I can't see how that was. Oh, got a bit of a steal here. Just a light $6 million to keep myself in
practically giving it away. Yeah. I mean, it's like,
you know, honestly, I'm surprised I didn't say bought two, you know, right? Because at that point, you just feel like pick up an extra one. It's like buying bananas at the grocery store. So you do have the Nets seemingly being committed. The players seem committed, as we say, reading the tea leaves of where this organization is going. One quick note on the Timberwolves too here that I do think is worth mentioning. You go over and look at it. Anthony Edwards is already going to be on his contract next year, $35.5 million. You're going to have Karl-Anthony Towns at 49, Rudy Gobert at over 43 million. After 25, 26, Gobert comes off the books and you can make different decisions. Certainly a factor with Jaden McDaniels also making north of 20 million over the next few seasons. Remember that, yes, this team did stay healthy. And Karl-Anthony Towns does have an injury history. All of a sudden, it could be we talk about next year. Well, what if Karl-Anthony Towns goes down? What would it mean for this team? So it's always,
you know what? Yeah, I mean, the asterisk on that is Rudy Gobert sat out game 2 and they absolutely destroyed the Nuggets in Denver. So it's like, I don't know, maybe they are kind of plug and play at this point with some of their main pieces. Now that's just one game, but I don't know. I just didn't want to, we'd be remiss if we didn't say that he missed. And they were like, no problem, even better. I mean, they're not, but
it is one of those things where you're like, when you're well built or when the system is well constructed, you're like, oh, missing defensive player of the year, that's okay. Like we'll still get 2-0 on the road, not a big deal. Don't worry about that. Right. We'll see you in game 3. Enjoy the birth of your son. Now for Oklahoma City Thunder, the thing for me in their model is, and this is I think relative to the Nets. If you're a go get, Donovan Mitchell, go get player XYZ, fine. Remember when Oklahoma City got Paul George, it was, we'll take a shot and we'll convince him that this is where he wants to be. And Paul George says, I want to be here. Also, make a trade. I'm going to go to LA. And when they did that, that was such a part of helping bolster what they were already doing. It's this blend of their own draft picks, of picks they got from that, of players they got from that help build up their new core. I do think there is probably a viable path that Nets fans wouldn't like, and that frankly the track record for Brooklyn would suggest they probably wouldn't go down. Yeah, we're going to trade for Donovan Mitchell maybe. And then maybe we'll just flip him in a year. Like, maybe we're going to turn around and we'll jettison him to kind of turn ourselves over. That seems unlikely, but that's a big part of what OKC did. Took a chance on a star, didn't have it work out, and was ready and willing to make that next decision very quickly.
Yeah, I mean, you could say there's like a 15, 20-year process, to get to this point, right? I mean, it's not that much because they had their big 3 in KD and Harden and Russ, and they moved on from those people. Didn't actually get tons back for either of those pieces that they moved on from, but they've been on this sort of path for years and years and years. And this is the contention. This is why you say, like, don't do this for the Nets. It's like, it's just going to take, it could take 10 years, right? Yeah. We just said how Minnesota took 20 till they kind of just landed on enough number 1 picks. And one of them ended up being maybe a generational superstar. I get why you would not sign up for that right now.
And just very quickly, like 100%, also the version of the timeline the Nets are on right now, I don't know. Where are they in 5 years? Where are they in 7 years? Like, right? Like the current idea of what this team is going to be. It's like, okay, didn't make the playoffs. Doesn't look like you're going to make the playoffs. So swing big or, do something a little more proactive or dramatic. Just, hey, shake it up and maybe try a different path. And I think it's always easiest to look at other examples and say, well, this is working now, so we should be trying that, as opposed to maybe we're in year, 4 of a very weird model that Sean Marks and Joe Tsai have in mind. And in 7 years, we're going to go, oh, look at what they did. They turned it all around with Cam Thomas and other young players.
Well, the easiest way, sorry, not the easiest, the best way to be good over the long term is to draft a superstar. Like that's easy. Like drafting a superstar is the best way to be great for a long time. Conversely, and sort of like on the shadow ledger here, is that the easiest way to suck forever is to keep drafting and not draft a superstar. Right. So, like,
which I always
going
say is a bad model for NBA teams. Why draft the non-superstar? Draft the superstar.
And so I get when people are like, well, building through the draft, it might not work. You are correct. It might not work. Like everything might not work. But, and unfortunately, the pain that you could feel, you feel more pain if you just keep going into the draft and keep blowing it every single year and just not working out. But the only way to grab the superstar is to kind of do that every single year and hope that one of them hits, right? So it has the highest ceiling, easily has the highest ceiling, right? To draft this guy, to give yourself lots of bites of the apple. It also has the lowest floor. And we watch a lot of these teams that have hit this floor year after year. Charlotte, Detroit, like these teams that just like Wizards are probably gearing up for this now. These teams that are just going to be bad for a long time because they keep trying it. And for whatever reason, it keeps not working. And so I get why you wouldn't want to do it. Unfortunately, as we're seeing now, the best way to get to the highest heights pretty much is to get into the draft and hit on one of these guys and hope that they're your generational guy. So I get why it's hard, but it also is kind of the solution also. It's a really weird set of circumstances.
And just briefly to touch back to the Timberwolves, again, if Anthony Edwards doesn't emerge as he does, while the Rudy Gobert, Karl Anthony Towns model seemed to be working from a regular season standpoint, we probably would have said, like, is this real? Was that really a great idea? Was that, what is their ceiling? Unless you have that pick to get that player to have it work for you. So I think that we've been saying this all off season. It has to be the blend of everything possible. And you're seeing the examples of this play themselves out. One quick note on Oklahoma City as well, because I talked about salaries for Minnesota. Got to remember, SGA is making $35 million next year and upwards to 40 going to 26, 27. That's going to feel like a great contract for this team. Yeah. Nobody else makes over. It's Dort. Dort is the next highest paid player next season at $16.5 million. And then it's 10, 8, and on down the line. Their model is so sexy because it's a bunch of young players making low money, which means you can still do everything. If they fall short in the Western Conference Finals this offseason, they can go, who's out there? What might be a really nice piece to bring in here that costs us 35, 40 million? Doesn't matter, right? You can go and make that big move. So their table is very much open to every single option going forward here. If I
two guys that are decent, hey, Nick Claxton looks pretty good on this roster, or there's go for two guys that can kind of bolster it because you already have the 1A guy.
Yes.
Like when you have the 1A guy, you can, and maybe a 2A guy in Jalen Williams, because he's awesome too.
Yeah.
Like if you have 1 and 1A kind of already, really, and they're at crazy value, then you are. I mean, this actually is like having the quarterback on the rookie contract, in the NFL. It's like now we'll just overpay for all the rest of the pieces, and now we're might be headed to the Super Bowl, right?
Yeah.
You understand that market better than I do because of the Giant stuff, but that seems to be analogous, right? Like to that situation.
Oh yeah. If you have all the pieces in place and all you need is the guy that orchestrates, boom. Well, we can go do that. We can spend whatever it takes to get that one missing player that takes everyone from being awesome to being absolutely elite. That takes us from being a number 1 seed in the regular season to being a finals appearance team and maybe a favorite to win the title as well. Out of these two models closing out, which one do you like better? Like I love what OKC has done. I know it has been a longer timeline, but I would say I love the OKC model. It's always youth. You always have this turnover. And even though they've had high draft picks, obviously, you've picked a lot of the right guys when it came to using that draft capital. You feel like you can sustain this engine probably going forward for a longer period of time, maybe than Minnesota, who 2 years from now will be having big decisions to make about Gobert, age, timeline, money, etc.
Yeah. Well, I think I think Minnesota's more built to win it all now because they can win it in a couple different ways. They have a couple different ways to win. I think like they don't have. It's not just kind of this way or bust. I mean, obviously the OKC is more of the long-term thing. It's hard for me to argue one or the other, I think. I mean, I know that's not how we want to close out here. So I'll just say, yeah, both. Okay.
We're going to
get out of here.
What's nice about it is that they're both about to make conference final appearances. It looks like, at least right now in this moment. I think I'll take either one. Either one, the Nets.
And by the way, even if they don't, even if they don't,
we didn't even
talk about like Luka. I mean, we're not even mentioning these other guys who are young too. Like we talked about SGA and Ant, but like Yuka's not old. Luka's not old, and so I don't know why I did that. This is two out of the last 3 episodes I've closed out with just like an embarrassing sort of like saying something wrong. Okay. Anyway, we didn't even get into him, but like this is also a landscape where, again, it makes the things very dicey for the Nets. We're gonna get out of here. Make sure you listen, subscribe wherever you listen to podcasts, Spotify, Apple, whatever. Rate and review it. Make sure you subscribe over on YouTube as well. Locked On Nets.
A plant of the agave family with stiff sword-like leaves and spikes of white bell-shaped flowers that are dependent upon the yucca moth for fertilization. Yes, that's the yucca plant, and it's found especially in warm regions of North America and Mexico.
One of the all-time great posts. We're back again tomorrow talking more Brooklyn Nets basketball.
Basketball. Eat your yucca. Basketball. Yeah.